So let's talk about free speech. And let's talk about the First Amendment because people think they know what the First Amendment says, and they think that they have unfettered right to say anything they wish to say. Well, we're going to talk about some law here, and I'm not a lawyer. I'm a guy who owned newspapers for 40 years, and so I'm a shade tree lawyer, and I also taught a class along with a friend of mine who is a lawyer, and it was called The Lawyer and His Client, and we covered a lot of that stuff at that time. Okay, who would believe that a law from 1798 called the Alien and Sedition Act is still around and is still being enforced, and which was something that the Trump administration used not that long ago in March of 2025 to deport people. The Alien and Sedition Act had four parts. Well, three of them have gone away, but they went away very slowly because we go through periods in this time when we are tolerant in this country of free speech, and then we are not tolerant of free speech at all. Generally speaking, we are less tolerant of free speech during wars and more tolerant during peaceful times. And boy, we are seeing an awful lot of free speech, which borders on I'm reluctant to characterize it, but there are an awful lot of words that were not being used for very good reasons, which were offensive, which are now in the lexicon of an awful lot of people. That's okay, but what's not okay is that a lack of knowledge that what you say, which may be provocative, is the last step before violence. And I'll get into this at some other time, but the speech which began to deteriorate somewhere around, I noticed it around 2013, 2014, where instead of saying to somebody who, you didn't think they had their facts right, you say, well, I don't think they quite had their facts right. Instead, you said, liar, they're lying. That's much harsher than what we're saying. All right, in 1919, a guy by the name of Schenck was handing out leaflets on a street corner, and he got arrested and he got thrown in jail. And the Supreme Court pretty unanimous, I think, ruled, well, he was unanimous. Anyway, they kept him in jail. And it doesn't really matter what the leaflets said so much as the fact that they ruled that he didn't have a right to hand these leaflets out. What the leaflets did say was uh, essentially sedition. It was encouraging people to defy the military and not to join the army uh, and so on. And the government at that time was completely intolerant of that. So I'll tell you the story of when I went to work in television in 1966 at the NBC station in St. Louis. At the time, I think it was the eighth largest in terms of volume and reach and so on in the United States, that station. And when I walked in that day as a writer and a producer, I was handed a list of names. And they said, these people, we do not put these people on the air ever. What they say is inflammatory, it's usually not true, and it is, if these people are given uh, the right to be on the air here in St. Louis, um, people will have trouble sorting out that this is not true. And it was a list of blacks, which were known as Negroes in those days, and they were Negro leaders. And then I was handed a second list, and they said, "Here's another list of black leaders. These are people who we may or may not agree with, but they are reasoned people. When they say something, it's true, and these are people who we can work with. Um, not necessarily on all things that we would agree, but we can work with them. But we do not allow people on our station to say inflammatory things." And so that's the way it was. And by the way, in those days, there were only 5 outlets in St. Louis. There were 3 TV stations: ABC, NBC, CBS. Arguably, we had a education station, but they weren't doing news at the time. And then we had two daily newspapers, a morning paper, St. Louis Globe and Democrat, and we had the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in the afternoon. This TV station where I was working was owned by Pulitzer, which owned the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. So later on, I'm down in Oklahoma with my newspapers and printing presses. I could print 12 to 18,000 papers an hour off 5.5 mile long rolls. So we could print stuff. And one day a man walked in to my office, and by the way, with that kind of capacity and the number of publications we were doing, we were grossly underusing the utilization of our presses. At one point, we would later on print the flyers for Sears, Roebuck. Another time, I would print a daily newspaper for somebody else. But most of the time, our presses really, they'd roll 20 or 30 minutes a day, and then they wouldn't be used. Anyway, so we're amenable to printing stuff. And this guy walks in and says, well, I want you to print me 10 or 20,000 copies of this. Well, let me have a look. And it was a picture of Lyndon Johnson raping the Statue of Liberty. And it was an anti-war, anti-Vietnam protest. And I said, I'm not going to print it. And he said, well, I thought you were in the printing business. Oh, you know, blah, 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 that kind of nonsense. I said, well, you know, I'm not going to give, I'm not going to be involved in something like this. You know, I don't. Good luck. And he went on somewhere else and somewhere else and somewhere else. And he finally found somebody, and I remember where, but I won't say, printer who printed it. And he got arrested by the FBI, and the newspaper or the printer got raided. And of course, both those cases were dismissed, but it sure was a lot of pain and so forth. Moreover, in the newspaper business, and again, I was there for for a number of decades, folks would come in and they would say things, and they would tell you things. Did you know that this, you know, and you listen, always listen. And when the guys from Elam City, or whatever it was called, which is where Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the Oklahoma City Mirror building in 1995, those guys, I knew those guys because they were survivalists, and they would come in from time to time, and they'd tell these tales about how awful the government was, what the government was doing, and how we needed a revolution and all this kind of stuff. And you listen to them. And why do you listen? Because I and newspaper people and wise people are interested in what everybody has to say. I don't have to agree with you, and I don't have to get into an argument with you about what you believe, but I'm very interested in what you believe. And folks, I'm going to say we've lost that. People are not listening to other people. And crazy things are being said, but they are being put on TV and in the various cable and so forth. And so you are essentially corrupting and debasing, but turning the public dialogue into something that is really rank and ugly and disturbing, because we're allowing people now to say nonsensical things. It is said in the last day or two, or not very long after the attempted assassination of President Trump at the White House correspondent dinner, and it is online that Trump cooked that up and it didn't happen. It's called a false flag. Please, please, please. You can say anything, but responsible people and responsible news organizations ought not be putting this on the air, because it destabilizes, and because it's simply not true, and because it gets in the way of a public dialogue. And here's how it gets in the way of the public dialogue. When you are asserting something absolutely insane and somebody calls you out on it, then they get in an argument with you on it. And yes, it is. No, nonsense. And in the end, we don't take on people who are crazy. You ignore them. It's like dealing with children. You know, your kid may say something really crazy, and you may say, okay, that's crazy, but if the kid keeps going on and on and on about it, if you ignore them, and this is true, if you ignore what people are saying, at some point, people will begin listening to themselves. And in a high number of instances, they'll start sounding crazy to themselves. So we ought not be broadcasting that. An example of this one, by the way, I was a surveyor. I was elected to Secretary of Water and Sewer Commission in some place down in Florida. They paid me to this elected position. I donated all the money somewhere. But anyway, people would call me, and they would be, blah 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 blah, and I never interrupted them. Let them talk, because what's happening today is you get about 2 or 3 sentences out and somebody interrupts you and they go, and when you interrupt somebody, what you're saying is, I'm not interested in what you're saying. I'm interested in what I'm saying. And you're also saying, shut up, shut up, shut up. But if you let somebody talk, and by the way, one night some woman called me and she said, this is what you're going to do. And then she started in on me, blah, 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 why we're going to do this on the water and the sewer, whatever it was. And I think she kept waiting for me to. She'd pause, and I said, "Yeah, I'm listening." Again, and we got into about 40 minutes into this, and it's like petting a dog that wants to be petted. You pet the dog until the dog goes away. And it may confuse the dog, but eventually the dog gets tired of getting petted. Eventually, she got tired of talking, and she came back to and said, are you going to do this or not? And I said, no. And I explained, took a few minutes and explained why. And she had come back to asking me periodically during this, no, 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 no. And at the end, she said, well, you may be right. I don't think so, but you may be right. And thank you. Now, all I did was listen to this woman. All I did was give her a chance to listen to herself. And if we would do that, which is very difficult in television. Remember, I did TV. Not only did I do TV back in the summer and fall of 1966, I also went back and I worked for CBS in 80 and 84 doing reporting, in 84 for a local station and 80 for the network. And you don't have time. What you've got on television is you've got a minute 15, you've got a 30 more seconds. You say to one of your guests, who's making a really interesting point, you got 10 more seconds. He may need 10 more minutes to really explain it. But we're not in that world in these times. Well, if you think you got free speech, you don't. You should be very careful what you say for 2 reasons. One, it could well be illegal. Okay? If you go into the Pentagon and somebody tells you something and you go out and print it, and it's, that could well be deemed theft of secrets, gets you in trouble. And the other reason is, if you really get into a shouting match with somebody who starts to lose and is really, you're right and you're wrong, and that's where people punch one another in the nose. That's where people kick people. That's where because violence is the next step after careless speech. So there are a lot of reasons why people should do as this wonderful line from a motion picture long since lost called Sebastian from the 1960s. And they're code breakers. And one of the characters says, actually the woman says to the lead character about something you just said. And she said, you can say that, but it doesn't mean that you should. And 2 years ago, you would have never have said that. We're at a time where 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people would have never said that. And we're in a time today when they still should.